Could you identify yourself?
Phil Katz, American Association of Museums. I'm going to focus on a number that I know the most about, which is the number in the first slide that Ann showed with all the various parts of the cultural workforce. And I fixate on the number about museums workers that are in there, which is wildly inadequate and wrong in at least 3 ways. And maybe it suggests ways that all of the other numbers need to be looked at a little more critically. First of all, just on its face compared to everything else we know about our field, a number of 35,000 people who are defined as archivists, curators, and museum technicians is an undercount, and is wrong. And we can get into technical reasons why others aren't captured. It doesn't capture a variety of other core professional activities at our institutions. For example, museum educators, talking about sort of a hybrid activity, aren't captured in that slice of museum professionals. So not all activities are counted. It's messy around the edges, and this gets to what we consider cultural workforce and not cultural workforce. That number, even we just look at people with those fairly narrow technical role in museums, art museum people all count in there, but people who do comparable work in zoos and aquariums, which we consider part of museums and consider part of culture, aren't counted there as well. Pushing it a little more, if we think about what are the limits of the cultural workforce as a whole, if we look at all people who are paid to work in museums in this country, the number is not 35,000, it's an order of magnitude higher. My estimate, based on some things in ACS, suggests 400,000 plus, but that would include sort of everyone who works in a museum, from, you know, the director of the Met to the person who picks up the garbage at the local historical society. And are we going to say that one of those people is part of the cultural workforce and one of them isn't? So just some sense of why I think that number is wrong, with some suggestions of why we need to think all around the edges for all these numbers.
Well, that's a very welcome intervention, and it reminds me that Judy Lee Reed and I have been talking for a year or more about similar responses to the counts that we get from the census. I'm thinking about, you know, the city of Chicago, for instance. The woman who runs their artist program said, I think we have 3 times as many artists as the ones who list. One thing I want to clarify for you is that these numbers are for occupations, and they're just narrowly for the curator occupation. We have data, it's in Greg and my article, and also they have done a very, very careful accounting in their cultural industry work in New England for the cultural industry. So we can get the number, and we have the number for the museum, zoo, et cetera sector. And you would see much larger numbers there. But as you point out, they include everybody in the whole institution. I think using both is a very powerful way to go, which is one of the reasons why I was trying to show from the occupational side how it maps onto the industry side. But there's no question about it, and that really, again, underscores the point that Howard Becker makes in his book about art worlds, that we think of the individual artist and what they do, but really for that individual artist to be able to make their work, you know, learn what they need for it, get all this inputs, et cetera, it's much bigger. One thing I'd really like to recommend to everybody is Bill Byer's wonderful study done in 2 rounds for the city of Seattle on the music industry. Just the graphic in there is amazing, because it shows all of the different parts of the music industry, starting with who teaches music, who makes instruments, who repairs them, who produces the equipment for recording, and maps that out for the whole Seattle economy. And in Seattle, they actually have an office of film and music, and they celebrate the music industry in Seattle, defined in this very broad way. I think you can get it on the Office of Film and Music website for the city of Seattle.
Just an add-on to what Ann said. What Doug DiNatale and I did is we created one set of estimates for the cultural labor force, more broadly defined than the NEA 11 artists, and another set of estimates for all employees of organizations that we defined as cultural and they included many in the profit sector as well as the not-for-profit sector. The second number is larger. The interesting question that we couldn't answer because the second data source was the economic census and the first data source was the population census. How many of the artists identified in the population work for these other organizations? My rough guess is probably no more than half, especially since a lot of artists are self-employed.
And I'll just say that's why the one table I put up, which is drawn for the census, enables us to do that because artists are, allocated to these occupational and industry categories. So you can actually map that out, including they show the extent to which you're self-employed and work in those different industries. So it is possible to do with a lot of sweat.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Over there.
I'm curious, this is Ian Moss. Since we've had some discussion about the census and various different federal data sources for artists, I'm curious if anybody knows about or can speak to the ways that other countries collect information about their artists, and is there anything that maybe we can learn from that? Have they set it up, and have they used different strategies for either collecting or analyzing the information?
That's an excellent question. I wish I could speak authoritatively to it, but does anyone else have any insights to offer, suggestions? Have you been following that in?
I believe that there's a lot of great work in the UK, and just recently somebody told me about websites for them, and also probably Canada. And, I could probably get you the names of people who've done those kinds of studies. I'm sure they've been done for the UK, and maybe other European countries too, I don't know. Australia,
perhaps,
yes,
yeah.
Australia. Yes, David Throsby's work on Australia. Good point.
Yes, Holly.
And could you talk a little bit about what you've seen downstream from your research, how communities that you've studied have actually used any of the material that you've generated, and what you think the implications of research to practice are?
Wow, well, I think everybody who is a researcher in this room could say a lot about that, so I welcome other people to do that. First of all, I did pass around the link guide to the data sets. We created, this was really grueling work, thank God for graduate students. We created data sets for all the link communities from the census data, all the socioeconomic data on artists, and we put it in comparative framework. And we did it, I don't know, for 6 or 7 or 8 states and about 18 different metropolitan areas. And we delivered it to them. We had phone conversations with them. We encouraged them to use it. And in the guide itself, we have about 7 or 8 instances of how people use the data right in there. Again, to encourage, because when we had presented it to the group as a whole, we really encouraged them to use it. So, and I know that many people have come back to me and said they've used it in different ways since then. But those are some of the examples, including for the Washington State Artists Health Insurance Project and many other things. Many of the things I've done and things other people have done, I think maybe Greg could really speak to the intersection between their work and the creative economy work in New England, which I think is the most advanced in the country at a regional level and a state level. Now there's a new creative industries unit in the state government in Massachusetts, isn't that right? So we're really making some inroads there. And I would just say in general, I just get so many requests from people, not only in the communities where we've done work, but in other communities for this data, for me to come and give talks on this data, for me to come in and work with them on their trying to present, this is particularly to present to city governments and state governments and for coalition building around some of these issues for programs for artists and in general to make the case for the arts.
Randy?
Yeah, I would just follow up because I'm usually, a few months behind Anne's speaking tour. Now I go to a lot of the places you go, and number one, they talk about what a fabulous, research and tool it is, but how it's used as research to galvanize a very broad sectors of the community together to have a conversation about the value of the arts, culture, as it relates to the economy, as it relates to planning, employment, and everything. So I think one of the really important pieces, as you just mentioned it briefly, is how it's really served as a great tool to build a very inclusive conversation as people look ahead to what they want their communities to look like. So I think that's a great benefit. So good work.
I want to say, too, that I just, when I first started presenting this work publicly, the overwhelming response of artists and people who had arts organizations is, thank you for putting us in numbers. Thank you for enabling us to see ourselves and to see ourselves in comparison to the rest of the workforce and other places. And I was kind of blown away by that because I just didn't necessarily, this is the stuff I've been doing all my life for different occupations. I had no idea that people would find it that meaningful. And now I'm trying to use photography in a similar way to try to also, because if anybody wants to talk about that and has experience, I really believe that photographs, and they're not that easy to produce in the way you want to, and they take a lot of work to get them the right way and to format them to tell the message that you want to tell. But I think we should use, this is what we have artists, we should use artistic ways of even doing research. I believe that there's a lot of research data in the photographs that I use, but also as a way of communicating about it.
Can I ask you also, Anne, do you know, is iconography, I mean, is that used, in terms of photos, has that been used in other kinds of research, maybe not about artists, but to what extent has photography been used kind of in documenting, you know, research findings? Have you seen that in other kinds of studies, or anybody?
Somebody must know. That's over my head. I just only,
it's a really enticing possibility.
Dawning on me now. But I think so. I think if you look, you know, one comparison I always make, because I worked so long on scientists and engineers and worked with the AAAS, you know, the images and the information that's put out there about scientists and engineers is stunning in our society. If you listen to public radio, you know, every week there's several pieces done that explore the scientist and his or her work and so on and so forth. And there are lots and lots of images. I think, you know, the Science AAAS as an organization of scientists and the National Science Foundation is doing a tremendous amount of communicative work about the meaning of science and scientists and engineers for the society. And I think they use photography a lot.
I thought I saw a hand go up. Yes, Stephen.
For those of you who have worked with decennial census or the American Community Survey or the Census of Industries, I guess my question is, if we came to a collective definition of what we thought a creative worker was, what would be missing from if we use these three data sources primarily? What are we not capturing? Which kinds of creative workers would not be counted? Or would they be in another, or are they in other categories that we could find them through these data sources, but what are the deficiencies of those data sources for measuring and tracking the creative workforce over time?
That's a great question. David?
I'd like to go back to the comment of the gentleman in regard to museums. And that is, I think that a lot of the question of what is missing depends on what you're looking for. In this sense, we talk about performing artists. Performing artists who've been around actors will tell you they are part very much of an ensemble effort that includes carpenters, electricians, lighting technicians, costumers, and so on and so forth. And this is something, you know, in the coalition of unions that the Department for Professional Employees represents, the stage employees are a major force. The industry doesn't exist on stage or on television or on film without those folks. It's an ensemble effort. And I think it goes back to the point about someone has to pick up the garbage from the local museum, but it's not just about picking up garbage. These are highly skilled, creative people who might not be considered artists. And yet, if you think about I saw a wonderful DVD about the making of Angels and Demons. They employed something like 83 highly talented sculptors as they recreated the Vatican, right? And painters, fine arts workers. They might not be captured as artists.
It sounds like they could be captured. That is, they identify their sector. So if we were taking a slice that way, we could. I'm curious about what we can't get.
Asking about what we can't get or what we don't want to get. I want to make sure I understand.
Well, I think that's a really serious question. I think some of the things we can't get at have come out earlier today. I think this question of hybrid artists, for instance. In our crossover survey, 2/3 of the artists responding said they had two art forms. You know, we put them in one box or another. This was stunning to us, that they worked across artistic disciplines. So that's one set of things. Also, just in general, what we really need, you know, for our entire cultural enterprise in this country is, you know, a diminishing of the space between the supposed non-artists and artists. And none of this data enables us to do this. Data is basically data on workforce, on people who do this for their work. There's so many other artists who are doing artwork, but it's not, you know, it's not their major occupation. There's this whole participatory arts movement, which is really being implemented in policy some places. What is it called? The live arts thing in Los Angeles, the thing that the Music Center is doing, where they're, the active arts, thank you, where Josephine Ramirez has created this amazing program where, for instance, people are invited to come together to pick up their high school instruments and play them together. And some performing groups have come out of this, like a group called Highfalutin. Just, there are a lot of really important issues for us as a community that we can't solve with these, you know, databases, secondary databases of artists. We also do a lot of interviewing. Lots of other people in this room have done interviewing. It's another way of really finding out. But again, most of those interviews are pretty much confined to, you know, a focus on artists and not so much on the relationship between, you know, a larger community and artists.
I think related to that, it begs the question of at what point do people who are doing the kind of work that I think we're interested in stop calling themselves artists? And that has to do with how the work is validated to some extent within the arts field. So for example, in New Orleans a few weeks ago, there's a particular program there that is about, it's an artist-led program that is environmentally focused, and it's about returning native plants to the area. And it's done through a collective of artists. If you talk to them, they're hesitant about whether they want to call themselves artists anymore. So one guy told me, I guess you could call me a curator, but I'm kind of the groundskeeper. So there's this identity issue that becomes problematic, and I think Nick alluded to it with the teaching artist identity. So I think those are some of the, it gets back to the hybrid stuff too, but those are, I'm curious about the self-definition in the ACS, and how much control there really is, if any, over that, and how much of it comes, how much of an awareness or self-awareness might be cultivated within the sector, within the arts sector in ways that to some extent maybe aren't encouraged now.
As far as the ACS, it's just like the decennial census and similar to the current population survey. It's a household survey, so we, in the case of the ACS, we hand them a form, or in the current population survey, we actually have a field rep out there, and we ask them what their major job duties are. And so it really is its self-identification, and it's sort of what your mood is that day, what way you're going to answer it. And then we try to take that, and we have our definitions and try to take what you said and park it into what's closest. And it really depends on what the person tells us.
I've been thinking about the question about, who the numbers aren't capturing. And the work that I've been doing with my colleague Carol Gill at the University of Illinois Chicago, we did a 3-year qualitative study for the NEA on barriers and facilitators to arts careers for people with disabilities. And one of the things that we found is that the systemic oppression and discrimination against people with disabilities from earliest education and training programs through professionalization through their careers is so extensive that it's difficult for the people who are out there doing arts work to be connected to any of the organizations in which people find research participants. The other thing is that there's a section in our community of people who live on Social Security and Social Security disability income. And for those artists to report income from the arts can jeopardize their eligibility for those benefits. And if they report their incomes, then they can lose their benefits, they can lose their health insurance, they can lose their personal assistance. So there's an income threshold over which you basically have to leap over to make enough money or to be affiliated with an institution so that you can get those things that you need to survive. But then, you know, so all the people in the middle get left out. So there are people out there who are doing arts work, calling themselves artists, working in the arts, working a lot with communities, doing volunteer work, but who kind of hide because they don't, you know, we got a lot of information because, you know, both Carol and I have disabilities. People trusted us to tell us their stories. A lot of people are working, getting paid under the table, going through all kinds of strategies so that it's paradoxical because you want public attention, but you have to also hide at the same time that you're doing your work. So I think that without understanding and having information on the barriers that people are facing to even entering the arts as a career, then we don't understand what's keeping them out and what kind of actual work they're doing. Does that make sense?
I'm glad that you're speaking. You had a question, Joan. I just thought that one thing that's very useful is I know that Carrie's doing work also on quantitative, or rather your colleague is Carol Gill, also Dr. Gill, on quantifying some of the data to back up the qualitative data you found through the case studies of these artists in these communities. And I think, I mean, it's going to drive on respondent-driven sampling, which, of course, you're seated right next to Joan, who's sort of a pioneer of that.
I actually have two things. One is in relation to Maria, because my question is not when you stop calling yourself an artist, but when you start calling yourself an artist. But the other thing, I think Stephen's question is very appropriate about if we put all these data sets together, what's missing. I think one of the things that's missing that we haven't done a very good job on is the relationship of artists' work to their other work. Not always assuming they're only waiting to do their artwork full-time. There are some very synergistic relationships. I mean, if you're a ceramicist, you do like having the kiln at the place where you teach. There are reasons that actors are waiters so that they can leave their job and go on tour. This is very different for different kinds of artists. And I think we've kind of broad brushed that, assuming that, you know, all artists should be working full-time as artists, when actually there are other pieces in their lives which help integrate them into society and which we don't know enough about.
I thought of it. I could think of a million things, but there's just a couple other things that I thought I'd bring to your attention when you're trying to count people with disabilities in these surveys or in statistics, and this is something that Carol and I are grappling with, is that a lot of the ways in which we ask for information might not be accessible to certain people with disabilities. So for instance, there could be, if we're using technology, there may be difficulties for people who are blind or who use screen readers to use the online technology, or it can be so cumbersome, or they may be so overwhelmed by information they have to be choosy about what they interact with, or some people who use American Sign Language as a primary means of communication might not be able to communicate in a qualitative study without maybe the use of vlogs, you know, or visual communication. There's also problems of economic access to technology. So when I hear, you know, we're doing a lot of stuff online now, but some people don't have access to online survey instruments. And then, but then I was distressed to hear about this postcard, whoever sent out the postcard to get people to respond in written forms too. Or people who also have speech disabilities in doing interviews. So there's lots of those kind of barriers to keep in mind when we're trying to reach populations for whom those kind of instruments might not be, literally accessible.
Thank you, Carrie. Anyone in the audience? I'd love to hear from some people. Oh, Carlos. Oh, and then Susan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlos Manjarres from IMLS. One of the things that I'm concerned with industry classifications, particularly when we're talking about fields that don't have very formalized credentialing systems, is the extent to which these classifications are really robust enough, or on the other hand, whether or not they provide certain artificial categories that are not really so meaningful over time. And so I guess my concern really is that that could have a really big impact on whether or not change over time. The trend analysis is something that we really should put a lot of stock in, particularly in fields where the nature of work has changed so significantly over time. But the other thing, I think that one of the big advances of the American Community Surveys, where you're categorizing work and then identifying your most active work, is an important advance. However, there's the possibility that in the coding, I've forgotten where it's done, Indiana or somewhere, wherever it's done in the Midwest, it's entirely possible that we're coding back to our industry classifications and our employment codes that exist already. So while we have rich respondent supplied information that, as we all know, could be coded in any number of ways, we could be replicating classifications that might not be so hot to begin with. And so I guess one of the questions I have is has to do with basically the guidance for coding the ACS responses, and whether or not there are folks looking at the data maybe with a different lens, not trying to push it into existing classifications, employment classifications, but playing around with alternative coding schemes.
The coding's done in Jeffersonville, Indiana, so yes, you're correct. And it's both the occupation and industry classification. We code many other things there also. And we have a staff that is dedicated to just that just that coding operation. They code both the current population survey, the ACS, and other household surveys that require coding for occupation and industry. As I mentioned earlier, the occupation comes from the SOC, the Standard Occupation Classification, which we do update every 10 years so that we can be current and that we are, the committee's made up of people from several agencies who work with occupations and are trying very hard to make sure that we don't make changes just willy-nilly, and that we are keeping up with what the current workforce scheme is. The same thing is true with the industry. The industry classifications are on the NAECS, which is it's updated every 5 years to coincide with the economic census of the Census Bureau. And from the NAECS, we then take a subset of that to put on our household surveys, because the NAECS is a very long list of industries, and again, it would be very hard to capture on a household survey. But those also are updated every 5 years to coincide with the economic census. Yeah.
Okay.
That doesn't really address the question.
Right. I'd like to address the question, actually.
Okay, great.
Yes, it's really important for us to understand our categories. And these categories are, fashioned, through expertise, et cetera. I spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand the SOC codes in the big changeover that happened in the 1990s, which made it so difficult for us to compare between 1990 and 2000. And for the SOC changeover, there were actually a number of academics who were labor economists and others brought in a series of meetings and who wrote papers about how we should change the SOC codes the way we should. I got those only by calling somebody at the Bureau of Labor Statistics who told me they existed. I didn't know that. And he actually found them and sent me copies. It was about a pile that high. The point of my telling that story is that, you know, we should be more proactive as a community in interacting with the census over these definitions. And if we have ideas about the ways in which they're imperfect and we would like to change them, you know, this would be, I assume that now would be a time to do it. So I don't know if anybody has the energy and excitement to do that, but later I'd like to ask a few more questions about the American Community Survey, but maybe other people would like to address it.
I think we have someone here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, don't we? Could you stand up, please?
Roger Moncars from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and
thank you for coming.
There's no question that we want the public to be very involved in the SOC process. I specialize in IT occupations, and my expertise was tapped on, but we reached out. I reached out to contacts I have, and I encourage each of you. I think the email address is soc@bls.gov. You can start writing to them and telling them how you want classifications to change, how you want the occupations to kind of interact with each other. And like Jennifer mentioned, once they actually revise the SOC, we put it out for public comment. We want the public to comment. Oftentimes we don't get enough public comment. So very good point to be proactive, reach out. We'll try to reach out to you as much as possible, but there's only so much we can do because obviously it is a huge undertaking to revise a 850 occupation classification. So thanks.
Thank you for coming, Roger. Yeah.
I'd just like to reflect. Earlier, I gave my card to Ms. Day and asked if I could be added to a list. I'd like to suggest that having a list that notifies when these deliberations are about to occur would certainly be helpful for those of us who don't read the Federal Register page by page on a daily basis. It would be very helpful.
Right. I think, Susan, do you still have a question? Yeah, or comment? Does someone have a mic? We'll give you a mic.
Susan Seifert, University of Pennsylvania. I guess it's on the topic of what's missing, or I have two things I was thinking about. That in some ways we're talking occupation and industry. I feel like there are a couple of conversations. One's occupation and industry, and another is workforce. The title of the forum was workforce, but that's actually the topic we're not addressing. And it's something that I'm not that familiar with, but I think the Howard Becker, some of the comments about the museum categories and Howard Becker, the art world, the artist inside the art world, is starting to think about the cultural workforce in addition to the artist, or as the context for the artist. And that when someone had asked about international work, I mean, just a cursory look, I do feel like the United Kingdom, Canada is, I think this also circles back to the question, why research? Why are we doing this? Joan asked. And I guess if one question is, if we're looking at policy around workforce, the UK agency, national agencies are actually looking at workforce. What's the music industry in there? What's the museum industry? What's the library industry? They're going down and asking what is every skill. They're inventorying skills, they're inventorying occupations and titles, and putting them by geographic part of the country and saying who's got people, you know, and they have an inventory of unemployed or underemployed people in each geography, and they're matchmaking. Canada, certain provinces in Canada are doing the same thing. This is just a real quick cursory look, but I can't see anybody in the United States doing this. So that was one thought, and I'm just curious about if that's the direction this forum's interested in.
So you're talking about sector by sector, I mean, or are you talking,
Well,
I mean, skill set?
What I'm talking about is, are we interested in workforce development or in the cultural economy, whereas in fact, really what we're talking about is the artist. You know, so in fact, I think, you know, they're all valid. It's just that it's different conversation and different kinds of data. And I think it connects to some of the questions raised. And could I just mention one other thing is I think that designer category that keeps growing in all these trends is maybe underdeveloped in terms of a missing piece, because I think there's a set of designers that are like the industrial designers. They're creative designers. It's the artisan category of productive designers. It's not the service-oriented designer like the interior designer or whatever. And I think in Philadelphia we're starting to inventory this and explore it. So.
It's also graphic designers. Right?
Graphic. Yeah. Yes, but it's just, I think it might be a little underdeveloped in terms of our data collection. But.
Great. Could we go there and then back there?
Thank you. This actually brings up just a great question, because I think for a person that loves data but is often confused about how my data is given to me, or like I like the number at the end, but when I start parsing out where it comes from or how it's gotten there, I'm confused. I think there's a really great need for somebody, and potentially the NEA could be a good place for this to begin, to do a data primer, to really say, here is census data. This looks at workforce occupations. Here's the upside of looking at these numbers for artists. Here's the downside. So we have workforce artists. Here's one thing. Then there's practicing artists. Practicing artists go from a continuum from aspirational to paycheck artists to workforce artists. Here's how they are captured in this kind of data. So that the average person could then also figure out, like almost like a map of data collection, which Joan, I think, in a certain sense, gave us in the beginning a little bit of a beginning to, but to give us a sense not only of what data is available, but how to read that data, but also then looking forward, if you have a challenge set, if you're a change agent and you want to make change, what kind of data could you suggest to a graduate student or one of Anne's smart students, or just say, hey, let's look at this, and that if the industry could say, here are holes, right? We know that we've got these covered. Here are holes as a directive, as a group. Here are holes for other people to cover. Then I think we'd also be giving direction in a larger sense to people coming up in the data ranks to really sort of parse out some of these finer distinctions.
Great, thank you. Kelly?
Thanks, Kelly Barstate again, National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. And I was watching this television show on the universe last night on the Science Channel, and it was talking about dark matter, right? So there are all of these very exciting things out there in the cosmos. There are stars, there are planets, there are galaxies, but actually, unbeknownst to all of us down here, there is a cosmic superstructure of dark matter, which is actually the stuff that holds the whole universe together, and scientists have no idea what it is. And I'm having that experience kind of translating a little bit. I mean, we've been talking about some really important, kind of celestial objects, right? We've been talking about the force part of workforce today, I think a lot, in terms of the number of people that are employed in certain occupations and how we can best aggregate those, and how we can improve on our systems for tracking hours, earnings, things like that. And all of those are really important, but I guess I'm also very curious about the work part of that workforce phrase. I think that some of the work that you're doing, Maria, some of the Link projects, some of the other smaller scale studies that are really unpacking as part of this workforce equation, not just what's the force, but what's the work? You know, not just what are artists earning, but how are they spending their time? And how are they spending their resources? And what's happening when artists are doing work. And that just seems to me like more of an undiscovered country. And, going to your great catalytic question, Stephen, about what's missing or what's deficient, I wondered if anybody had any ideas or comments or remarks on that.
Ruby Lerner?
I come to research meetings and I always end up feeling really guilty because I feel that, we're sitting on a potential gold mine of information that, we aren't a research organization. So we're not really utilizing, I think, the opportunities that we have. So for instance, when we do a grant round, we have a public, offering, and 2,000 to 2,500 people apply every time we have a grant round. We could be asking certain questions, that could come from a group like this that might extract certain data that could be tracked over time. We're going back now to all 400 of the artists that we have supported over the last decade. Again, it's a subset, but I think probably a very interesting one. Particularly because there are so many hybrid artists in it. And I feel that everyone here should be able to contribute questions to that. We're going to do a big survey of our artists. So we have some opportunities, I think, in an ongoing way that really are underutilized. And I think Kelly could perhaps get at, in a deeper way, some of the questions that you're raising.
Mary Jo.
I'll pick up on the workforce and the question about what's missing. And the questions about, are we talking about occupations, sectors, whatever. And so my area is actually economic competitiveness before NGA, and I run the economic development division there in workforce. So you have to know where I'm coming from. What this conversation reminds me of is two conversations that always happen in economic development. It starts with, the good example is information technology. When we first figured out there was a whole new sector out there, information technology, it was all about, the folks who worked in those businesses or that sector or that industry wanted numbers to show who they were and what they were doing. And that was great, and they really hung on to that until they figured out the next elevation up was actually, no, we're not really a separate sector. We're important to all sectors and all parts of the economy. And so then we had a more sophisticated analysis of the impact of IT on the economy. You're almost there, I think, in the hybrid analysis, but not quite. You haven't expanded it as broad as I think you should. Then the third level of IT conversation is, no, everybody has to have IT skills. And it means every profession going forward will demand knowledge of technology and be doing it so you forget this whole issue about, then it becomes a conversation about what skills do you need to have in order to be competitive in the 21st century. I think that's where your goal is. Because if you really know what's going on out there and what governors and everybody else care about is your best triangle to look at is tough times, tough choices. If you haven't seen Mark Tucker's work, he's got a triangle that looks like this, where work is going in the future. The bottom, most of the jobs in the bottom of that triangle are work that's done by machines or work that's routine, and it's all going overseas. The top of the triangle is creative work, broadly defined, and the only hope of a developing country is to have as much work as they can in the creative part of this pyramid. And more what we need to be thinking about is, that's not about artists. It's about creativity, imagination, problem solving, design, all kinds of things. But the important thing is those skills are going to be important for every single sector that's going to be stayed embedded in the United States, just about. There is also another group, which is what they call jobs or industries that require face-to-face. nurses, they're not, you know, that's an occupation. I would argue they're also problem solvers, but they're, so the important thing is, I think, for what's missing, how do you constantly keep thinking in your mind, we want to elevate the analysis that we're doing, because ultimately, in my point of view, from this country's competitiveness, is we have to get as so many people as we can to have that creativity, that imagination, and those skills that are going to be required. I don't care where you work. It's going to be important in almost any kind of thing that's going to be important and lucrative going forward. Now, the folks who are probably going to beat you to that conversation is the green conversation, because they're going through the exact same thing. Who are we? What do we count? Is it about green, making green things, providing green services? Or is it about the sustainability officer inside of Corporation X, and how are we counting that? My argument to them is, yes, we need to understand all that, but ultimately, if we do this well, everybody will be thinking about sustainability in every one of their occupations. So what is the training and the kinds of support do we put in place so that, one, in that case, everybody's thinking about sustainability and efficiency and productivity. In your case, what do we do to ensure that every single individual is using the creativity, imagination to their greatest extent possible? And I think that's kind of the way I would sort of encourage you to think about where are we on this track of understanding what's going on.
On that hopeful note, we're going to have to break, but I encourage you to keep that energy bottled up, because we're going to now roll up our sleeves and kind of move this into some direction, hopefully. Thanks.